Well, if there is one habit that has served me well all through my years in business, it is knowing when the noise of the moment becomes a signal about the system itself. And I've been doing this long enough, over 6 decades now, to have developed a pretty good sense for that distinction. Most of what happens day to day is noise, political theater, headlines designed to capture attention, controversies that seem enormous in the moment but fade within weeks. But occasionally, not often, but occasionally, something happens that's more than noise. That tells you something fundamental about how the system works, about whether the rules are stable, about whether the institutions we rely on are functioning properly. What we are watching now is one of those moments. And I say that not to be dramatic, not to scare anyone, but because the facts warrant serious attention. A New York appeals court stepped in, rewrote some of the penalties in a civil fraud case tied to Donald Trump's business valuations. So we've got an appellate court reviewing a lower court decision. That's normal. That's how the system works. Appeals happen. Courts review each other's work. And the appeals court said the monetary penalty that had been imposed originally, around $450 million, was excessive. They reduced it significantly. That's also not unprecedented. Appeals courts sometimes find that trial courts went too far in their remedies, and yet left intact the most extraordinary part of the ruling. And this is the key. This is what matters most from a business and systemic perspective. The fraud finding stands. The appellate court didn't overturn the finding that fraud occurred. They didn't say the trial court got it wrong on the facts. They didn't exonerate Trump or his organization. They said, yes, fraud happened. Yes, the findings were sound. We're just adjusting the penalty. That's a huge distinction. Because a fraud finding against a major business organization, especially one connected to a former and current president, that has massive implications. And the oversight of his business remains in force. This is the extraordinary part. The court-appointed monitor, the restrictions on business operations, the ongoing supervision of the Trump organization's financial dealings, all of that stays in place. The appeals court upheld it. When a court takes that degree of control over a private enterprise connected to a former president, investors ought to pay attention, because this is unusual, very unusual. Courts don't typically take over business operations unless there's been serious, sustained wrongdoing that requires ongoing supervision to prevent future violations. It's the kind of remedy you see in cases involving organized crime, or massive frauds, or companies that have shown they can't be trusted to operate properly without supervision. And when that's being applied to an enterprise connected to someone who's currently president, well, that raises questions about the business, about governance, about systemic risk. This is not about partisan drama. And I want to be very clear about this. I'm not making a political point. I'm not advocating for or against Trump. I'm looking at this from a business perspective, from an investor's perspective, from the viewpoint of someone who needs to understand systemic risk and institutional stability. It is about whether the rules that markets rely on are still predictable. Markets need to know that fraud is fraud, that if you inflate your assets to get better loan terms, there are consequences, that the rules apply even to powerful people. If those rules aren't enforced, if powerful figures can commit fraud without real accountability, that undermines confidence in the entire system. But markets also need to know that penalties are proportionate, that courts aren't weaponized for political purposes, that the system is fair and predictable. So when you've got a fraud finding that stands, with ongoing oversight, but with reduced penalties, that sends a mixed signal, and mixed signals create uncertainty. Before we go further, there are claims of an emergency impeachment effort, and stories about a cabinet on the brink of collapse. I've seen these reports. They're circulating widely. They're generating a lot of attention and concern, and I want to be absolutely clear. There is no verified report yet that such events have formally taken place. I'm not going to tell you that impeachment articles have been filed when I haven't seen official documentation. I'm not going to claim the cabinet is collapsing when I haven't seen confirmed resignations. They remain unconfirmed speculation, rumors, reports from unnamed sources, claims that may or may not have basis in fact, and it's important to be honest about that distinction. To not treat speculation as fact just because it's dramatic or because it fits a narrative we find compelling. But, and this is important, make no mistakes, rumors often arise from stress points. Rumors don't come from nowhere. They emerge when there's real pressure, real tension, real instability, creating conditions where dramatic events seem plausible. When people start speculating about emergency impeachment, it's usually because there are genuine stresses on the administration, real scandals or crises or failures that make such speculation seem reasonable. And when multiple legal and political pressures converge on a presidency or a political figure, history teaches us that sudden constitutional maneuvers are not impossible. I've lived through enough presidencies to know this. Nixon resigned when the pressure became overwhelming. Clinton was impeached when scandals reached a critical mass. Trump himself was impeached twice during his first term. Constitutional crises can develop quickly when conditions are right, when legal problems combine with political weakness, when allies start defecting, when the pressure reaches unsustainable levels. We have seen impeachment move quickly before when circumstances lined up. The Clinton impeachment went from scandal to articles to trial in a matter of months. Trump's first impeachment proceeded very rapidly once the Ukraine scandal broke. These processes can accelerate when there's momentum, when there's political will, when events force the issue. And it is always wise to understand the landscape in which rumors take root. So even if the specific claims about emergency impeachment aren't verified yet, it's worth understanding why they're circulating. What pressures exist that make such rumors plausible? What stress points are creating this speculation? That context matters. It helps you understand risk. It helps you prepare for potential volatility or instability. Now let me tell you what is factual, because we need to ground this in what we actually know, not in speculation or rumor. The New York civil fraud case brought by the Attorney General found that the Trump Organization had inflated its asset valuations. That's established fact. The trial happened. Evidence was presented. Findings were made. The court determined that Trump and his organization systematically overstated the value of properties and assets to get better terms on loans and insurance. Inflating a property's value by double or triple, claiming assets were worth hundreds of millions when they were worth much less. Providing financial statements to banks that materially misrepresented the organization's actual worth. That was the finding, based on extensive evidence, documents, testimony, expert analysis. A trial court issued a set of remedies that included a very large monetary penalty and restrictions on how the business could operate in New York. The original penalty was about $450 million, plus interest. It had grown to over $500 million, plus the appointment of an independent monitor to oversee the business, plus restrictions on Trump's ability to serve as an officer or director of New York corporations, plus limitations on borrowing and business activities. Very aggressive remedies. The kind you impose when you've found serious, sustained fraud that requires strong corrective measures. Earlier this year, an appeals court stepped in and vacated the monetary penalty, calling it excessive. So the appellate court reviewed the remedies and said, "This is too much. The penalty doesn't fit the circumstances. It's disproportionate." They reduced it significantly, cut it roughly in half to somewhere around $250 million. That's a big reduction, a major change in the financial consequences Trump faces. But, and this is crucial, they didn't overturn the fraud finding. The appellate court agreed that fraud occurred. They agreed with the factual findings. They agreed that the Trump Organization inflated valuations and misrepresented its financial condition. They just thought the penalty was too severe, and they kept the monitor in place. They kept the business restrictions. They kept the ongoing oversight. So Trump got some relief on the financial penalty. But the finding that he committed fraud, that stands. The supervision of his business, that continues. And that creates a really interesting situation from a governance and risk perspective. You've got a sitting president who's been found by a court to have committed fraud, not accused of fraud, found to have committed fraud, in a ruling that's been upheld on appeal. You've got his business operations under court supervision. with an independent monitor reporting to the court about compliance and financial dealings. You've got ongoing restrictions on how he can operate that business, what kinds of transactions he can engage in, what oversight applies to his activities. All of this happening while he's serving as President of the United States. Now, is that a constitutional crisis? Not necessarily. The Constitution doesn't prohibit someone with civil fraud findings from serving as president. The voters knew about these cases and elected him anyway. But it creates complexity. It creates potential conflicts. It creates situations where his personal business interests, which are under court supervision for fraud, intersect with his official duties as president. And that's the kind of structural instability that creates risk. Not necessarily immediate, dramatic risk, but the slow-building kind, the kind that compounds over time. The appeals court ruling tells us something important. The system is working, at least partially. The fraud was found, evidence was evaluated, consequences were imposed. When the penalties seemed excessive, they were adjusted, but the underlying finding of wrongdoing wasn't swept away. That's the rule of law functioning. Imperfectly, perhaps, slowly, certainly, but functioning. But it also tells us something else. This isn't over. The monitor stays in place. The oversight continues. Trump's business activities remain under scrutiny. And that ongoing supervision of a sitting president's business empire, that's unprecedented. That creates ongoing questions about conflicts, about compliance, about whether the rules are being followed. So when you combine that with the Epstein file controversy we discussed earlier, the tariff-induced economic volatility, the legal cases in multiple jurisdictions, the political pressures from within his own party, you start to see why rumors about emergency impeachment or cabinet collapse might circulate. Not because they're necessarily true, but because there are enough stress points, enough instability, enough converging pressures that people can imagine such scenarios. And in investing, in business, in understanding systemic risk, you have to pay attention to those stress points. You have to understand the landscape where crisis becomes possible. Not to panic, not to overreact, but to be aware, to be prepared, to understand that when multiple pressures converge, unexpected things can happen. I've spent my career studying how systems break down under pressure, how businesses fail when stress exceeds their capacity to adapt, how institutions crack when the weight becomes too much. And what I see right now is a system under significant stress. A president whose business has been found to have committed fraud with ongoing court supervision. Economic policies creating market volatility and uncertainty. Legal problems across multiple jurisdictions. Political support showing signs of erosion. International relationships strained. Each one of those individually might be manageable, but altogether, all hitting at once, that's compound risk. That's the kind of situation where small triggers can create large consequences. So are we seeing an emergency impeachment? A cabinet collapse? A constitutional crisis? I don't know. The reports aren't verified. The claims remain speculative. But am I paying attention? Absolutely. Because the conditions exist where such things could happen. The stresses are real. The pressures are building. The system is being tested. And whether or not the specific dramatic events materialize, the underlying instability is real. The fraud finding is real. The court oversight is real. The economic volatility is real. The political pressures are real. Those things affect markets. They affect confidence. They affect the predictability that investors and businesses rely on. So, I'm watching, carefully. Not with fear, but with attention. Not panicking, but preparing. Not assuming the worst, but not ignoring the warning signs either. Because that's what 60+ years of experience has taught me. Pay attention to the system, not just the noise. Understand the stress points. Recognize when multiple pressures are converging. And position yourself accordingly, with strong balance sheets, with cash reserves, with focus on fundamentals rather than speculation. The noise will continue. The rumors will keep circulating. The headlines will keep screaming. But the facts, the fraud finding that stands, the ongoing oversight, the economic pressures, The political strains, those are what matter. Those are what shape outcomes. Those are what investors need to understand. Not to pick political sides, but to understand risk, to recognize instability, to prepare for volatility. That's my message. That's what the situation requires. That's what experience teaches. Stay informed, stay calm, stay focused on what's real rather than what's speculated. And remember, in times of uncertainty, the fundamentals matter more than ever, not less. That's the only way through. For investors, for businesses, for all of us trying to navigate these complicated, uncertain times. Well, but the court very clearly did not undo the underlying fraud judgment. And this is the part that's really important to understand. The part that gets lost in headlines about Trump wins on appeal or penalty reduced. The appeals court didn't say there was no fraud. They didn't say the trial court got it wrong. They didn't exonerate anyone or clear anyone's name. They said fraud happened. The findings were correct. We're just adjusting the remedy because the penalty seemed excessive. That's a very different thing. Very different. And it did not lift the operational restrictions or remove the oversight mechanism that sits over the company. This is crucial. The monitor stays. The supervision continues. The restrictions on business operations remain in force. In business terms, the fine is gone, but the supervision remains. Think about what that means. If you're a company that's been found to have committed fraud, and the court says, okay, we're reducing your fine, but we're keeping someone watching over everything you do, well, that's not a win. That's not vindication. That's the court saying, we still don't trust you. We still think you need supervision. We're just adjusting how much we're punishing you financially. That is the part most people miss. They see penalty reduced and think, Trump won. The case is over. Everything's fine. But that's not what happened. The case isn't over. The supervision isn't over. The consequences aren't over. This was not a clean win. It was a reshaping of consequences. From heavy financial penalty plus supervision to lighter financial penalty but supervision remains, that's still significant consequences. That's still a finding of fraud with ongoing remedies. The oversight itself is not symbolic. And I want to emphasize this because people sometimes dismiss these court-appointed monitors as just paperwork, just bureaucracy, just someone filing reports that nobody reads. That's not how it works. Not when the oversight is real. A court-appointed monitor retains authority to examine large transactions. So, if the Trump organization wants to make a major deal, buy a property, sell an asset, enter into a significant contract, the monitor gets to look at it, to review the terms, to ask questions, review transfers, analyze financing arrangements. Who's lending money? On what terms? What are the valuations being used? Are the financial statements accurate? Are there conflicts of interest? All of that gets examined by someone whose job is to make sure fraud isn't happening again, and in some cases block or question structural changes. The monitor doesn't just observe. They have power. They can raise objections. They can question whether a transaction is proper. In some circumstances, they can prevent things from happening. That's real operational constraint. Real limitation on business freedom. When a monitor has that power, ownership stays on paper, but operational freedom becomes limited. You still own the company. Your name's still on the door. You're still the legal owner, but you can't just do whatever you want. You can't make major decisions without someone looking over your shoulder. You can't structure deals without oversight. You can't operate with the freedom that normal business owners have. And that limitation has real costs in flexibility, in speed, in the ability to seize opportunities, in the willingness of partners to work with you. This brings us to the marketplace. Markets do not simply trade earnings and forecasts. They trade trust. That's what people often don't understand about markets. They think it's all about numbers, about quarterly earnings and revenue growth and profit margins. And those things matter, sure, but underneath all of that is trust. Trust that the numbers are real, that the financial statements are accurate, that management is honest, that the company operates with integrity. When that trust is damaged, everything else becomes harder. When a court essentially signals that it does not trust a company's leadership to act without supervision, counterparties take note. Banks, lenders, partners, suppliers, customers, everyone who does business with the company. They all see that court ruling. They all understand what it means. This company committed fraud. This company can't be trusted to operate without oversight. And they adjust accordingly. They tighten covenants. If you're a bank lending to this company, you add more restrictions, more reporting requirements, more conditions, more protections for yourself. They adjust premiums. Insurance costs more. Loans cost more. Interest rates are higher. Because the risk is higher. Because trust is lower. They slow negotiations. Deals that might have closed quickly now take longer. Because everyone's being more careful. Everyone's doing more due diligence. Everyone's worried about reputational risk from being associated with a company under court supervision for fraud. They price higher risk into every future cash flow. When you're valuing the company, when you're deciding what to pay for an asset or what to charge for a loan, you build in a risk premium, a discount for the uncertainty, a cushion for the possibility that things aren't what they seem. Markets can swallow bad policy or bad quarters as long as the rules are clear. I've seen companies weather terrible decisions. I've seen them survive massive losses. I've seen them come back from the brink. But they can do that when the situation is clear, when everyone understands what happened, why it happened, and what the path forward looks like. Bad news that's clear and definitive? Markets can handle that. They price it in and move on. What they cannot price is unpredictability, when you don't know what's going to happen next, when the rules keep changing, when new revelations keep emerging, when you can't model the future with any confidence. That's when markets freeze. That's when valuations collapse. That's when capital becomes expensive or unavailable. And when an appeals court removes a financial penalty but leaves a warning sign that says the leadership cannot be left unsupervised, the uncertainty becomes the headline, not the number. Most coverage focused on $450 million penalty reduced to $250 million. That's a big number change. That's dramatic. But the real story is fraud finding upheld. Supervision continues. Company operates under court oversight. That's the uncertainty. That's the signal that trust hasn't been restored. That's the warning to markets that this situation isn't resolved. When you have multiple major investigations operating at the same time, each requiring legal teams, testimony, scheduling, discovery, and strategic decisions, it spreads leadership thin. And this is where the compounding effect really starts to hurt. If you're dealing with one legal case, you can manage it. You allocate resources. You develop a strategy. You work through it. But when you've got New York civil fraud case with ongoing oversight, federal criminal cases in multiple jurisdictions, state criminal cases, congressional investigations, potential impeachment proceedings, all happening simultaneously, all demanding attention, all requiring strategic decisions and resource allocation, that's overwhelming. That's more than any organization can handle effectively while also trying to, run a country or run a business. In business, 2 overlapping lawsuits can cripple a company's planning function. I've seen this happen. Company gets sued. Management has to spend time on the lawsuit instead of on operations. Strategy gets delayed. Decisions get postponed. The business suffers not because of the lawsuit's merits, but because of the distraction and resource drain. Add a second lawsuit? Now you've got overlapping demands, different legal teams, different timelines, different strategic considerations. And the planning function, the ability to make long-term decisions, to invest, to grow, that gets crippled. 3 can halt expansion entirely. At 3 simultaneous major lawsuits, companies often just go into defensive mode. No new initiatives, no expansion, no risk-taking. Just hunker down, try to survive, hope to make it through. The same principles apply here. Trump's dealing with way more than 3 cases. He's got multiple criminal indictments, civil cases, investigations, congressional inquiries, all while trying to run the country, all while making policy decisions, all while managing international relationships and economic crises. The bandwidth just isn't there. Something has to give. Either the legal cases don't get the attention they need, or the presidential duties don't get the attention they need. Neither is a good outcome. And here's what that means for markets and for governance. From a market perspective, it creates uncertainty about policy. When the president is distracted by legal battles, when decision-making is delayed or inconsistent, when attention is divided, policy becomes less predictable, less coherent, more reactive. That creates volatility. That makes planning harder. That reduces confidence. From a governance perspective, it raises questions about capacity. Can someone effectively govern while fighting multiple legal battles? Can they make good decisions under that kind of pressure? Can they focus on the national interest when their personal legal jeopardy is so acute? These aren't just theoretical questions. They have real consequences for how government functions, how responsive it is to crises, how well it serves the public, and the fraud finding with ongoing supervision that adds another layer of complexity. Because now you've got a president whose business operations are under court supervision for fraud, who can't make major business decisions without a monitor reviewing them, and that creates potential conflicts. What if a policy decision would benefit his business? How do we know it's being made for the right reasons? How do we ensure he's acting in the national interest rather than his personal business interest? The monitor can watch the business. But who's monitoring the intersection between his business interests and his presidential duties? These are structural problems, governance problems, the kind that don't have easy answers. So when you step back and look at the full picture, fraud finding upheld, ongoing court supervision of business operations, multiple criminal and civil cases pending, economic policies creating market volatility, political support showing cracks, international relationships strained, all happening simultaneously, all creating demands on attention and resources, all generating uncertainty and unpredictability. That's why I keep coming back to compound risk, because each of these individually might be manageable. But together they create a situation that's very difficult to navigate successfully. Markets hate this kind of compounding uncertainty. They can't price it. They can't model it. They can't predict what comes next. So they pull back. They demand higher returns. They reduce exposure. They wait for clarity. And that pulling back, that defensive posturing, that itself becomes an economic drag. That slows growth. That reduces investment. That makes everyone a little bit worse off. This is why the appeals court ruling matters beyond just the dollar amount of the penalty. It's not about whether Trump pays $250 million or $450 million. That's significant to him personally, sure. But for the broader system, for markets, for governance, that's not the key issue. The key issue is fraud was found. Supervision continues. Trust hasn't been restored. Uncertainty persists. And as long as that's true, as long as a sitting president's business operates under court supervision for fraud, as long as multiple legal cases are pending, as long as policy is unpredictable, the system remains under stress. Markets will continue to be volatile, investors will continue to be cautious, economic growth will continue to be constrained. Not because of any single factor, but because of the accumulation, the compound effect, the way all these pressures feed into each other and create systemic instability. That's what I'm watching. That's what concerns me. Not any single headline or any single development, but the pattern, the convergence of multiple stresses, the compounding of risks, the erosion of the predictability that markets and governance require to function well. And the appeals court ruling reducing the penalty but maintaining the fraud finding and supervision, that's just one more data point in that pattern. One more signal that the stress isn't resolving, that the problems aren't going away, that the system is still under pressure that shows no sign of letting up. That's the reality. That's what the numbers and the facts tell us. And until that changes, until some of these pressures resolve, until some clarity emerges, until the compounding effect reverses, we should expect continued volatility, continued uncertainty, continued caution from markets and investors. Not panic, not crisis necessarily, but ongoing stress, ongoing pressure, ongoing questions about stability and predictability. That's where we are. That's what the appeals court ruling confirms rather than resolves. And that's why it matters, more than the headline number suggests, more than most people realize. Because it's not about the money. It's about trust, about predictability, about whether the system can handle this level of compound stress without breaking. We're still finding out the answer to that question. And the appeals court ruling didn't resolve it, it just reshaped it. The stress continues. The supervision continues. The uncertainty continues. And markets, businesses, and citizens all have to navigate that reality as best they can. That's the situation. Honestly and clearly stated. Make of it what you will. Well, now we come back to those impeachment rumors circulating online, and I want to address these head on because they're generating a lot of anxiety, a lot of speculation, a lot of questions. There is no evidence that an emergency impeachment is underway or that the cabinet has staged any formal collapse. I need to be crystal clear about this. I haven't seen verified reports. I haven't seen official documentation. I haven't seen credible journalists with named sources confirming these specific claims. So if you're hearing that impeachment articles have been filed, that cabinet members are resigning en masse, that there's some kind of constitutional crisis happening right this minute, well, I can't confirm any of that based on what's actually been documented. But it is true that when the stress around an executive office becomes overwhelming, internal pressures rise, and this is the important nuance. Just because specific rumors aren't verified doesn't mean the underlying conditions they reflect aren't real. When an administration is under this much pressure, legal, political, economic, institutional, the stress is real. The pressure on personnel is real. The strain on relationships is real. People start questioning their loyalty. They start thinking about their own futures. They start wondering if they want to keep hitching their wagon to someone who's facing this many problems. That internal pressure doesn't always result in dramatic resignations or cabinet collapses, but it creates instability. It creates conditions where such things become more possible. History has shown that when legal, political, and constitutional forces collide, rapid action sometimes follows. And I've lived through enough of this history to recognize the pattern. Richard Nixon resigned under the weight of an impending impeachment. Watergate, the Saturday Night Massacre, the tapes, the cover-up unraveling, the House Judiciary Committee moving toward impeachment articles. And Nixon looked at the math. He looked at the support he had in the Senate. He realized he couldn't survive a trial. And he resigned rather than go through the formal impeachment process. That happened relatively quickly once the final pressures converged. Within days of the smoking gun tape being released, he was gone. Andrew Johnson faced impeachment in the aftermath of war and political conflict. The post-Civil War period. Reconstruction. Massive political tensions between the president and Congress over how to reintegrate the southern states. Johnson was impeached by the House, came within one vote of being removed by the Senate. The entire process was driven by political and constitutional conflict that had been building for years. Bill Clinton was impeached during a period of intense investigative pressure. The Starr investigation. Monica Lewinsky. Testimony. Lies under oath. Political warfare between the White House and congressional Republicans. The impeachment moved quickly once the Lewinsky scandal broke. Within months, he was impeached by the House, though acquitted by the Senate. In each case, rumors preceded action because institutions were already strained. That's the key insight. These things don't come out of nowhere. There's always a buildup, always warning signs, always rumors circulating before official action happens. Because people inside the institutions know what's happening before it becomes public. They sense the pressure. They see the dynamics. They start talking, and those conversations leak out as rumors. The rumors aren't always accurate in their specifics. Sometimes they're exaggerated. Sometimes they're premature. Sometimes they reflect what people fear or hope will happen rather than what's actually happening. But they're rarely completely baseless. They usually reflect real stress, real pressure, real instability in the system. That is why even unverified impeachment rumors today deserve understanding, not acceptance. Don't accept them as fact. Don't spread them as if they're confirmed. Don't make decisions based on unverified speculation. But do try to understand them. What are they telling you about the level of stress in the system? What conditions exist that make these rumors plausible enough to circulate widely? Understanding that context, that's valuable. That helps you assess risk. That helps you prepare for potential volatility. The environment is stressed enough that speculation grows naturally. When you've got a president under court supervision for fraud, facing multiple criminal indictments, dealing with economic volatility, seeing support erode among his own party members, well, speculation about impeachment or cabinet collapse doesn't seem far-fetched. It seems like a reasonable possibility given the level of stress. And so people speculate. They wonder. They prepare mentally for scenarios that might unfold. That speculation itself becomes a factor. It affects confidence. It affects decision-making. It affects how markets and institutions respond to each new development. Legal exposure has another cost that investors often overlook. And this is where we get into the practical, operational impacts that don't make headlines, but have real economic consequences. Defense teams cost money and attention. High-powered lawyers don't work cheap. When you're fighting multiple criminal and civil cases simultaneously, you need teams of attorneys, specialists in different areas, lots of billable hours. The money adds up fast, tens of millions, maybe hundreds of millions over time. But more importantly, defense teams require attention. They need strategic direction. They need decisions made. They need the client's involvement in key moments. Every hour spent on litigation is an hour not spent on policy, planning, or campaigning. And there are only so many hours in a day, only so much mental bandwidth available. If you're spending hours each day in legal strategy sessions, reviewing documents, preparing for testimony, making decisions about how to respond to new legal developments, well, that's time you're not spending on governing, not thinking about economic policy, not managing international relationships, not developing legislative strategy, not campaigning for your agenda. The opportunity cost is enormous. When legal matters stretch over months and years, they drain resources from normal operations. This isn't a short-term problem. These cases aren't resolving quickly. They drag on. Appeals, motions, hearings, trials, month after month, year after year potentially, all the while draining attention and resources that could be going to productive purposes. That shows up as delayed decisions. When you're distracted by legal battles, when you're conserving resources, when you're in defensive mode, you delay. You put off decisions that should be made. You wait and see rather than acting decisively. And those delays have costs, opportunities missed, problems that get worse because they're not addressed promptly, momentum lost, cautious lenders. If you're a bank or a financial institution looking at lending to someone under this much legal pressure, you're going to be cautious, very cautious. Higher scrutiny, more due diligence, tighter terms, more conditions, more protections built into the loan agreements, and higher borrowing costs. All that caution, all that risk, it gets priced in. Interest rates are higher, fees are higher. The cost of capital goes up. That makes everything more expensive, makes growth harder, makes survival more challenging. Markets feel this indirectly. It's not like there's a stock ticker that says, Trump legal costs $X million today. The impact is more subtle, more diffuse, but it's real. It shows up in policy uncertainty, in delayed decisions, in reduced confidence, in higher risk premiums across the board. Institutions that rely on trust, smooth governance, and predictable leadership begin to wobble when attention is divided. Think about how government is supposed to work. Agencies need direction. Policies need coordination. Crises need response. International relationships need management. All of that requires focused, consistent, predictable leadership. Someone who's paying attention, making decisions, providing direction. When leadership is distracted, divided, consumed by legal battles, all of that suffers. The machinery of government doesn't stop, but it runs less smoothly, less effectively. And that wobbling, that loss of smooth function, it has consequences for the economy, for national security, for the public welfare. And in a fiscal environment where national debt and borrowing needs are already high, even small frictions in trust can be costly. This is where it gets really important from a market's perspective. The U.S. government is the biggest borrower in the world. We have over $35 trillion in national debt. We issue trillions in new Treasury securities every year to finance government operations. That borrowing depends on trust. Trust that the U.S. government is stable, that it pays its debts, that it's managed responsibly, that it's a safe place to invest money. When trust gets damaged, even a little bit, borrowing costs go up. Even a small increase in interest rates on that much debt costs billions, maybe tens of billions or hundreds of billions annually. So when you've got a president under legal pressure, with fraud findings, with multiple indictments, with policy uncertainty that creates small frictions in trust, not enough to cause a crisis necessarily, not enough to make people stop buying Treasury securities, but enough to increase the risk premium, to push interest rates a little bit higher. And on $35 trillion in debt, even small increases in rates are enormously expensive. So you've got these cascading effects. Legal battles drain attention from governance. Governance suffers. Policy becomes less predictable. Markets become more uncertain. Borrowing costs rise for the individual and potentially for the government. Higher costs reduce capacity for investment and growth. Trust erodes incrementally. Risk premiums increase. The cost of doing business for everyone goes up. None of these effects are dramatic on their own. None of them make headlines, but they accumulate, they compound, and over time they add up to significant economic drag, significant loss of efficiency, significant costs that everyone bears. This is what I mean when I talk about systemic risk. It's not about any single dramatic event. It's about the accumulation of stresses that make the whole system less efficient, less stable, less predictable. The fraud finding with ongoing supervision, that's a stress. The multiple criminal indictments, more stress. The economic policy volatility, more stress. The political pressures and potential impeachment scenarios, more stress. Each one feeds the others. Each one makes the system a little more fragile, a little less resilient, a little more vulnerable to shocks. And the longer this continues, the longer these pressures remain unresolved, the more strain accumulates in the system. Eventually, something gives. Maybe it's an impeachment. Maybe it's a cabinet resignation. Maybe it's a market correction. Maybe it's a policy failure. Maybe it's something we haven't even thought of yet. But when systems are under this much stress, for this long, with this many compounding pressures, history suggests that eventually, something breaks. Now, I'm not predicting doom. I'm not saying catastrophe is inevitable. Systems are often more resilient than we think. They can absorb a lot of stress before breaking. But resilience has limits. And we're testing those limits right now. The impeachment rumors, verified or not, they're a symptom of that testing. They're a reflection of how much stress the system is under. How close we might be to some kind of breaking point. And even if those specific rumors don't pan out, even if there's no emergency impeachment or cabinet collapse this week, the underlying stresses remain. The fraud finding remains. The legal cases remain. The policy uncertainty remains. The economic pressures remain. The political frictions remain. All of it continues. All of it compounds. All of it tests the system's capacity to absorb stress without breaking. And that's why I keep emphasizing the importance of preparation, of caution, of defensive positioning. Not because I know what's going to happen. I don't. Nobody does. The future is fundamentally uncertain when systems are under this much stress, but because prudence requires preparing for volatility, for unexpected developments, for the possibility that stress leads to breakdown Rather than to resilient adaptation, keep cash available, keep debt low, focus on fundamentals. Don't make decisions based on optimistic assumptions about how things will resolve. Hope for the best, but prepare for the possibility that the stresses don't resolve smoothly, that something breaks, that the system's capacity to absorb all this pressure reaches its limit. That's not pessimism. That's not defeatism. That's just prudent risk management when you're watching a system under unprecedented stress from multiple directions simultaneously. The legal costs, financial and attentional, are real. The trust erosion is real. The governance challenges are real. The market impacts are real. And the impeachment rumors, verified or not, are a symptom of all of that, a reflection of how stressed the system has become. That's the situation, clearly and honestly stated, not to scare anyone, not to push any political agenda, but to help people understand the landscape, to help them recognize the risks, to help them prepare appropriately. Because in times like these, understanding is valuable. Clarity is valuable. Honest assessment of risks is valuable. Especially when the picture isn't pretty, even when the stresses are real and the outcomes uncertain, that's what I'm trying to provide. Not predictions, not promises, just clear-eyed analysis of what we're actually seeing and what it might mean. The rest is up to you. How you respond, how you prepare, how you navigate these uncertain times. But at least you'll be doing it with open eyes, with awareness of the real stresses and real risks. And that's better than the alternative, better than ignoring the warning signs, better than pretending everything's fine when the system is clearly under strain. The truth matters, even when it's uncomfortable. Maybe especially then. That's my message. Make of it what you will. Well, the broader institutional picture matters as well. Because we're not just talking about one fraud case or one legal battle. We're talking about something bigger, something systemic. Courts limiting executive actions, regulators pushing back, Congress engaged in constant confrontation. Think about what that means. You've got the judicial branch saying, no, you can't do that to executive actions. You've got regulatory agencies questioning policies and decisions. You've got Congress in constant battle with the White House over everything from budgets to investigations to policy priorities. And now a private business tied to public office placed under ongoing court supervision. That's a new element, something we haven't really seen before at this level. A sitting president's business empire operating under court-ordered supervision because of fraud findings. These are not isolated events. They form a cluster of institutional friction. See, any one of these individually might be normal. Courts check executive power, that's their job. Regulators push back on bad policy that's appropriate. Congress confronts the president, that's the system of checks and balances working. But all of them happening at once? All at maximum intensity? All creating resistance and friction and conflict? That's different. That's a pattern. That's the system straining under pressure. That squeezes the predictability premium investors rely on. Investors don't just price in earnings and growth. They price in predictability, the confidence that the rules are stable, that institutions function smoothly, that governance is reliable. When that predictability disappears, when institutions are in constant conflict, when policies are uncertain, when governance is questioned, the premium disappears, or gets replaced by a risk premium. This is not a call for panic, and I really want to emphasize this. I'm not saying sell everything. I'm not saying the sky is falling. I'm not predicting disaster. Panic is almost never the right response. It causes you to make emotional decisions, to sell at the worst time, to lock in losses that might have been temporary. It is a recognition that when institutions push against one another instead of working in alignment, risk premiums rise. That's just economics. That's how markets work. When uncertainty increases, when predictability decreases, when governance becomes questionable, risk premiums go up. Investors demand higher returns to compensate for the increased uncertainty. They pull back from risky investments. They become more conservative. Higher risk premiums mean slower growth, reduced investment, and cautious capital. And those things have real consequences for the economy, for jobs, for prosperity, for everyone's standard of living. When capital is cautious, when investment slows, when growth decelerates, we all feel it. Not immediately, maybe, but over time, it compounds into lower prosperity than we would have had otherwise. So, what should investors do? And this is where I can give practical advice based on 60 plus years of experience navigating all kinds of markets and environments. The advice is simple and grounded in decades of experience. Hold businesses you understand. Don't get fancy. Don't chase trends. Don't buy things because they're hot or because everyone else is buying them. Stick with businesses you actually understand, where you know how they make money, where you can evaluate their competitive position, where you can assess their management. That's the foundation of sound investing. Always has been, always will be. Keep cash ready for the moments when volatility creates real opportunity. This is why Berkshire holds $334 billion in cash. Not because I'm pessimistic, but because volatility creates opportunities. When markets overreact, when good businesses get sold down to unreasonable prices because of temporary fears, that's when you want to have cash available to buy. You can't take advantage of those opportunities if all your money is already deployed. Do not panic, because headlines are loud. Headlines are designed to grab attention, to create emotion, to make you feel like you need to do something immediately. Most of the time, the right response to loud headlines is to do nothing, to stay calm, to stick with your plan. Panic selling is how you destroy wealth. Calm patience is how you build it. But do not ignore governance either. And this is the key nuance. Don't panic, but don't ignore real problems. If management cannot be trusted, or if control mechanisms are uncertain, it does not matter how compelling the narrative is. You can have the best business model in the world, the best products, the best market position, the best growth prospects. But if management is dishonest, if governance is weak, if you can't trust the numbers or the decision-making well, that business is a bad investment, period. Because eventually, bad governance destroys value. Always does. Governance is part of valuation. When I'm evaluating what a business is worth, I'm not just looking at earnings and cash flow. I'm looking at governance, at management integrity, at systems of oversight and accountability. Good governance adds value. Bad governance destroys it. And right now, governance around this situation is under a cloud of supervision, litigation, and political pressure. That's a fact. That's not political opinion. That's observable reality. A president whose business is under court supervision for fraud, facing multiple indictments, operating in an environment of constant legal and political pressure, that affects governance. It affects predictability. It affects risk. And it should affect how investors think about anything connected to this situation. As I close, let me put the moment in perspective, because I don't want to leave you with just doom and gloom. That's not the full picture. I remain optimistic about the American system. I really do. And I say that not as blind patriotism, but as considered judgment based on historical experience. It has weathered storms far worse than this one. We've been through Civil War, Great Depression, World Wars, Watergate, financial crises, political upheavals, and the system survived, adapted, emerged, stronger in many ways. So I'm not predicting the end of America or the collapse of our institutions. I think we'll get through this, one way or another. The appeals court removed the financial shock, but left a structural constraint that investors must acknowledge. The penalty's been reduced. That's less dramatic than the original ruling, less of an immediate financial crisis, but the supervision remains. The fraud finding stands. The governance questions persist. That's the reality investors need to understand and factor into their decisions. So do what you should always do. This is timeless advice, not specific to this moment, not reactive to current headlines, just sound principles that apply always. Protect your capital. Don't take unnecessary risks. Don't bet more than you can afford to lose. Keep your balance sheet strong. Capital preservation is the foundation. You can't build wealth if you keep losing capital. Respect the rules of markets, the rules of valuation, the rules of risk management, the rules of governance. They exist for good reasons. Follow them, even when it's tempting not to. And never pay more than $1 for $1. This is fundamental. Don't overpay. Don't get caught up in hype or hope or narrative and pay more than something's actually worth. Especially when the rules around that dollar are under strain, when governance is questionable, when oversight is uncertain, when legal and political pressures are mounting. Be even more conservative about valuation. Demand a bigger margin of safety. Pay less than you might in normal circumstances. Protect yourself against the downside. Don't hesitate to give this channel a hand by liking and subscribing, because this kind of analysis, honest, clear-eyed, grounded in fundamentals rather than hype, it's valuable. It helps people make better decisions, and the more people who see it, who think critically about these issues, who understand the real risks and opportunities well, that's good for everyone. Thanks for staying till the end. I know this has been a long conversation, a lot of ground covered, a lot of complexity to work through. But these are important questions, important issues, things that affect your investments, your security, your future. So thank you for taking the time to think them through, for engaging with complexity rather than just accepting simple narratives. That's how you make good decisions. That's how you navigate uncertain times successfully. Stay informed, stay calm, stay focused on fundamentals. And remember, the noise will pass, but the principles endure. Trust them, follow them, let them guide you through whatever comes next. That's my message. That's my advice. Based on everything I've learned over a very long career watching markets and systems and human behavior, take it for what it's worth. Apply it as you see fit. And good luck navigating these interesting times we're living through. Because interesting they certainly are. And navigating them successfully requires wisdom, patience, and discipline. Qualities that never go out of style, no matter what the headlines say. Thanks again, and take care.